Thank you very much, Professor Goran.
And now I would like to introduce our last speaker in this first session. I'll say, of course, a few words about Dr. Mamuka, even if he's not lecturing now, his contribution to the conference, as well as the very fact that he indeed labored and worked and gave up on his time here. I would like to say a few words about Dr. Mamuka, who is a part of the team who organized the conference. He's a professor, a colleague, an interpreter, a translator, a commentator, lectures about Jewish culture at the Tbilisi University, Professor Mamuka. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Ro'i Yaakov. Professor Ro'i is a professor emeritus at the Tel Aviv University, wrote and edited books about the Soviet Union's Jewry, and his recent book about the Jewish movement in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in the 20th century was recently published in 2012. He wrote a very detailed course as well about spanning over 4 volumes about the Russian Jewry in the 20th century, and these volumes are definitely being used as a very seminal text for the study of Russian Jewry in the 20th century. He also published many articles and research publications about the Bukhara Jews and the identity of the Russian Jewry, while comparing them to those who left the Soviet Union and immigrated to the State of Israel. Professor Ro'i will talk about Jewish identity under the Soviet regime, the place of religion among the Georgian Jewry, Bukharan Jews, and the mountainous Jews. Professor Ro'i, please. Thank you very much to the chairperson. I wrote this paper. I wrote this paper together with another researcher, an anthropologist who could not be here today, Dr. Bram. He is a partner to all that I'm saying here, and I will move into English.
The paper seeks to examine how 3 Jewish communities, the Georgian, Bukharan, and Caucasian mountain Jews, maintained and actually consolidated their respective community identities under severe conditions of Soviet rule. Based on a dialogue between 2 disciplinary perspectives, history and anthropology, it seeks to use this comparative discourse to highlight some theoretical and methodological questions. We will explore briefly a number of topics regarding the preservation of Jewish communal identity under Soviet rule in all 3 groups. Our primary focus will be on adherence to Judaism and Jewish tradition, but we will also look at community life and leadership, and the attitude to Zionism and the land of Israel, the influence of the societies in which they lived, of the Republican and local government, and of state policies and often state persecution, and their input into the evolution of the respective identities of all 3 groups. Further factors, of course, have an impact on the maintenance of identity. An important example is the place of language, in our case both Hebrew and local Jewish languages. The group's socio-linguistic characteristics can have significant influence on the identity, and they contribute to understanding important differences between the communities under discussion. Any examination of Jewish identity must bear in mind its duality. Jewish identity combines both religious and ethnic peoplehood dimensions. These aspects are interwoven in everyday life, but need to be distinguished analytically. We will discuss the maintenance of religious practice and religious institutions, and at the same time expressions of Jewishness as an aspect of group identity and peoplehood. The ways that these aspects are interwoven were different between the three religious and ethno-cultural groups we are discussing. Finally, before embarking upon a historical description, it behoves us to address a common paradigm frequently applied in the existing research. The term Oriental Jewish communities in the Soviet Union, often applied to all three groups indiscriminately, conceals a tendency to look upon minority groups among Soviet Jews from the perspective of the Ashkenazi Jewish majority. Such a perspective can easily be translated into the problematic binary perceptions of modernization versus stagnation, or enlightenment and education versus traditionalism, that is frequently conducive to misperceptions and faulty conclusions. Our primary postulate is that the three groups under discussion need not, and indeed should not, be looked at by making analogies to the Soviet Union's Jewish majority, but rather by comparing the three per se. A discussion of the Georgian, Bukharan, and Caucasian mountain Jewish communities must indeed be placed in the center, in the context of the larger history of the Soviet Union, but no less so in the context of the specific characteristics of each group, its history, and its environment. The advent of Soviet rule did not happen simultaneously in Central Asia, Georgia, and the North and East Caucasus, nor did it occur in unilateral fashion. Yet by the mid-1920s, the Jewish community in all three areas found itself subjected to communist policies and tended to see it as an ethnic group that was both backward in its view of life, its adherence to religion and tradition, and needed to transform its economic existence. The Jews reacted at first by consolidating and/or creating communal institutions that would assist them in their social solitude and in the struggle to find new sources of livelihood. Ultimately, however, the economic activity of the three communities was inevitably the outcome of regime policy. The great majority of Jews now earned their living as artisans, employees in light industry, and in the public services. They also turned to higher learning, and with the years, more among them became professionals. All three groups went through major socio-economic transformation. While their economic existence was manifestly the outcome of a uniform state policy, the different administrative solutions that the central government in Moscow found for their respective regions led to variance in their community formation. The Georgian Jews remained basically under single Republican leadership, although some of the communities found themselves in the Abkhazian, South Ossetian, and Adjarian autonomies. Similarly, most Bukharan Jews reside in what was to become the Uzbek SSR, with just a few communities in Tajikistan and South Kazakhstan. The lot of the mountain Jews was very different, for they lived under diverse union and autonomous republican governments, Azerbaijan, Dagestan, Chechnya, Kabardino-Balkaria, and Stavropol, to name just the main ones, and were necessarily differently affected by the various fates of their respective regions. This added to the already existing diversity among mountain Jews, including 4 different dialects of Judeo-Tat, which was less salient among the other two groups, although among the Georgians too, the regional differences were important. The lot of all Jewish communities throughout the entire Soviet Union was also an inevitable consequence of the regime's anti-religious ideology and campaigns and of its general nationalities policy. Soviet nationalities policy played a dual role in respect to the preservation of Jewish identity among all the Soviet Union's Jewish communities. For while Soviet policy suppressed Judaism as a religion, it sustained Judishness, Yevreistvo, as an ethno-national category, creating a situation in which Jews were officially designed as such without ever enjoying any Jewish substance. At the same time, the Jews were greatly influenced by the application of Moscow's policies by the various Republican leaderships. And the further away these communities were from Moscow, the greater the significance of local government, especially in the non-Russian peripheries. The development of all three communities, however, was not only the outcome of external factors. Internal forces were no less relevant, and perhaps even more so. Certainly their starting point, their institutions and leaderships, as well as their measure of unison and Jewish practice, was totally at variance. Along with ongoing modernization and urbanization, all three communities made conscious efforts to retain the main facets of their religious tradition and continued throughout the Soviet period to observe Jewish religious practice. Indeed, we stress that modernization processes, which played an important role in the development of all three groups in the Soviet era, should not be conceived as necessarily counteracting the struggle to preserve the specific identity and community. In Central Asia, where secular nationalism was not strong among the local population and Islam was the central unifying force, religion was probably the essential ingredient of the indigenous Jews' identity at the beginning of Soviet rule. In the North Caucasus, ethno-cultural identities played a central role, and religion was interwoven with ethno-cultural identity, inter alia among the Jews who resided in this multi-ethnic part of the world. In Georgia and Azerbaijan, where modern nationalism was forced already prior to 1917, the situation was different among the Jews as well, as we shall see when we look at the attitude of the three groups to Zionism. Yet in Georgia and Azerbaijan too, Jewish religious practice was common and to all appearances the primary characteristic feature of the Jewish community. None of the three communities had an institutionalized tradition of Talmudic study. Nonetheless, despite the lack of textual knowledge, all three communities were immersed in their Jewishness. Perhaps indeed the fact that they were bound to custom rather than to the letter of Jewish law, to halakha, and maintained close links to the extended family and their Jewish surroundings, enabled them to persist in preserving the traditional way of life. Thus, Jewish traditions continue to be transmitted from one generation to the next as an integral part of their very being to the closely knit extended family in a society in which families were generally rather large and which the younger generation held great respect for its elders and their way of life. In the case of the Bukharan Jews, and in different ways also among Caucasian mountain Jews and Georgian Jews, they were helped in this, at least indirectly, by the adherence of their neighbors to their own traditions and their resistance to the call of the Soviet regime to modernization and secularization at the expense of their traditions and ethnic and cultural identity. At the same time, the Jewish awareness, consciousness, and identity of all three groups were boosted by manifest marks of distinction from their neighbors, of which both sides were constantly aware. The two main spheres in which Jewish tradition predominated in all three communities were life cycle rites and the Jewish holidays. They all had their own specific customs when it came to rites of passage, such as Elijah's rod, Matei Eliyahu, that was an integral part of the circumcision ceremony among Bukharan Jews, or the Caucasian Jewish rite of Bani Guru, a gathering of the close family who sit together at the end of a wedding and ritually invite relatives and friends who are not able to attend the occasion. Yet the basic feature of life cycle rites and ceremonies were preserved by all. Circumcision in particular was universally observed, even by party members who were unwilling to forego this basic symbol of belonging to the Jewish people, and sometimes forfeited their party cards for circumcising their sons. In the smaller, more outlying communities, for example, in Turkmenistan, when there were no longer people who could perform circumcision, a mohel would be invited from one of the larger cities. The marriage ceremony would inevitably be conducted by a rabbi and entailed not only the chuppah or wedding canopy, but also the ketubah, the traditional marriage contract. Weddings and other life cycle rites brought together friends and relatives and engendered community cohesion, cooperation, and mutual assistance. These occasions, together with the Jewish holidays, were thus the hub of their very being, certainly the axis around which their community existence persisted. Funerals, too, were conducted in strict accordance with Jewish rite. Among Bukharan Jews, all the menfolk of the Jewish quarter, the Mahallah, would accompany the deceased by foot all the way to the Jewish cemetery, while the Bukharan Jewish cemeteries boasted less and less tombstones with solely or eventually any Hebrew inscriptions or even Jewish dates. Most of those in the cemeteries of the Mountain and Georgian Jews retained Hebrew inscriptions, although with the years added some Russian, sometimes on the back. All three communities had a plethora of mourning rites that were especially important in the preservation of Jewish identity. All three communities observed, indeed celebrated, the Jewish festivals. They dressed in festive attire, and the shochet, the ritual slaughterer, would slaughter cattle for the community. In places where there was no shochet, one would come from the nearest town so that the Jews could have kosher meat for the holiday. The holiday that appears to have been the most generally observed in all three communities was the Passover. In many places, matzot, the unleavened bread, would be baked on the precincts on the synagogue. In the years when it was prohibited to bake matzot, in the 1930s and again in the 1960s, as the Passover approached, 5 or 10 Bukharan families would get together to do so in the courtyard of one of them, the men preparing the dough, often in the early morning before going to work, and the women and older children doing the actual baking. In some townships, the Jewish community would hire the flour mill for a few days, cleanse it, and prepare the flour. Similar traditions existed among Jews in the Caucasus. Although many Jews in all three communities became integrated into different Soviet organizations and institutions, and in the process adopted a less religious lifestyle, for most of them religious rites of passage and Jewish holidays remained an essential part of their identity, highlighting the centrality of religious practice as a primary feature of Jewish identity in the community. At the end of 1947, of the 190 officially recognized functioning Jewish communities, 31 were in Georgia, 14 said Bukharan Jews, and 6 Caucasian Jews. Some of these synagogues were closed down in the repressions of the 1950s and 60s, yet this proportion of between a quarter and a third remained throughout the Soviet period, although the three communities together counted for just over 5% of Soviet Jewry. In a number of communities, the closed synagogues continued operating unofficially as Jewish prayer houses, usually with the acquiescence of the local government. Sometimes the community was able to somehow have them officially reopened. In at least two cases, in Kutaisi in 1952 and in Derbent in the early 1960s, the Jews resorted to extreme measures to actually prevent closure. Lying on the road in front of the synagogue to prevent bulldozers from demolishing it or trucks from bringing in furniture to turn it into a local club. Certainly there were Jews in all three communities who never or rarely attended synagogue, yet its existence was important to them all, and many non-observant Jews contributed to the upkeep of the community synagogue. Young boys visited the synagogue in all three communities, despite the strict prohibition against children under 18 attending houses of prayer. Rabbis and older members of the community persisted in transmitting Jewish knowledge to young boys individually or in small groups as they approached the bar mitzvah. Given their sense of ethno-cultural and ethno-religious distinction, it was not surprising that when a Jewish national Aliyah movement surfaced in the late 60s, the three non-Ashkenazi communities joined in easily, for they prayed regularly for return to Zion, and they comprised a disproportionately large percentage of the 160,000 or so Soviet Jews who emigrated to Israel in the 1970s. As noted, Jewish identity involves both religious and ethnic peoplehood aspects, as well as specifically cultural features. All three groups, indeed, in addition to being ethno-religious groups, are also ethno-cultural groups. Cultural elements, such as dance and music, contributed both to the continuation and consolidation of a unique group identity and a mutual identity with other local groups of the region. The ways religious, ethno-cultural, and ethno-national dimensions of identity are interwoven need not be the same for every Jewish group, and there were important distinctions between the expressions of Jewishness as an aspect of group identity and peoplehood in our three cases. These emanated partly from their different history of ties to the Zionist movement, but they also mirrored the relations between religion and ethnicity in the societies in which they lived. The retention of Jewish identity, as well as the specific interrelation between different aspects of their identity, was influenced by the socio-linguistic characteristics of each group. Despite the process of Russification that occurred, especially among Caucasian Jews, but also among Bukharans, an important place was held by Hebrew and perhaps even more so by the group's Jewish language, whose role was significantly different in the communities under study. The connections of all three groups with Zionism reflected the proximity of the religious and ethnic or national aspects of their identity. The relations of the Bukharan Jews with the Zionist movement prior to the Bolshevik takeover and the influence of modern Jewish ethno-nationalism had been limited. But among Georgian Jews, the interrelations between religion and ethno-national identity were very different. Georgian Jews were a religious minority that had for centuries been an integral part of Georgian society. Linguistically, Georgian Jews were almost indistinguishable from their neighbors. The linguistic and cultural facets that distinguished Georgian Jews from their Christian neighbors were almost all connected to religion. Had it not been for the Georgian Jews' adherence to religious practice, the boundaries with the society around them might well, in the context of modernization and urbanization, have been eliminated completely. However, paradoxically, their ethno-cultural characteristics, together with early encounters with Zionism, created a unique confederation in which the national aspects of Judaism did play an important role in the consolidation of Georgian Jewish culture, Jewish identity under Soviet rule. These characteristics enabled the Georgian Jews, especially the intelligentsia in the cities, to adopt simultaneously Jewish Zionist and Georgian nationalism. A salient example is the Bazov family, notably Rabbi David Bazov, a Zionist activist who before the Soviet conquest of Georgia had connections with the Zionist movement, and his son Herzl, a writer highly appreciated among Georgian nationalist circles in Tbilisi. Despite the considerable inner diversity and the difference in the way culture and religion were interwoven among different communities of Caucasian Jews, in all of them, group identity was strongly connected to the group's Jewish language, Judeo-Tat. I don't want to go now into Judeo-Tat because our chairman is pressing me to finish, and I will just conclude. Rites of passage and Jewish holidays were the axis around which the three groups retained and perhaps even strengthened their Jewish identity in the Soviet period. Religious tradition and even religious institutions were kept during the harshest anti-religious campaigns, although there were differences in the impact of these campaigns in each community and in the patterns of resistance. In all three cases, Jewish identity linked to religious and ethno-cultural facets to an extent that makes it almost impossible to separate them. However, the ways religious, ethno-cultural, and ethno-national dimensions of identity were interwoven in each of these cases were different. This led to important distinctions in the expression of Jewishness, which is still evident in the specific characteristics of these groups in the post-Soviet era. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Well, אתם רואים, אנחנו התחלנו בתקופה עתיקה.
See, we started with the ancient era and we ended in the very, very modern time. So what we have left to do in the 3 days is to bridge those gaps, to fill them in. And definitely, I'm sure this challenge that we have started with Professor Goram of drawing that ancient time and the struggles and the challenges that we're facing, obviously, here in the diaspora, in this region, of course, and obviously the larger and the more massive group that, thank God, has immigrated to the land of Israel and integrates and struggles there over its own identity, of course. I would like to thank you, sir, to you, the President,
for being with us and opening this important session, and all the important guests that we are honored by their presence here. We would like to ask you now to go for we'll go for a break for just 10-15 minutes for coffee, and then we'll come back to continue with our program. 10
10-15 minutes break.